So I'll now hand over to Anne.
Well, I'm perhaps very much the outsider in this. I must admit that I got drawn into looking at Barbara Hepworth's photographic records because of Michael's initiative. So my contribution would be very much the response to her work from the perspective of someone who photographs sculptors and their work today. And perhaps there are more questions than answers. I hope I can come up with some questions. I would like to look at the relationship between sculptor and photographer, which is obviously close to my heart. I would like to look at the relationship between sculpture and photography as a medium. And I would like to look at the aspect of transience, permanence, and time in general. Starting off with photographer and sculptor, very interesting contribution at the very beginning from Alice. She touched very much on something I feel strongly about and that I think is worth looking at in relation to Hepworth, not only for the photographs that were taken by her dealer, but more generally in terms of how did she work with photographers. It comes very much across that she took control of her own image, she took control of how her work was presented. Is it really like that, or is it, I would look from today's perspective more at a situation of a dialogue. Would she actually respond to photographers' suggestions of how her work was presented? For instance, if I were to work with a sculptor, they would explain their work to me. They would have some idea what they would like to see. It can be quite different to what I would like to show. So you are entering into this kind of dialogue where hopefully each one brings something into that final product. I don't know whether there are any records, comments by her about photographers whom she worked with. Did she have a preference for some who would actually make suggestions or come up with other views of her work? There is also touched on by Alice that whole kind of power play going on between photographer and sculptor, and there's a lot of personal chemistry involved, which can't be seen in the final result. But to give an example, I was working with a photographer, wood engraver, Garrick Palmer, on Pallant House, and he saw that I had photographed Elizabeth Frink, and he asked me how I got on with her, and I said, well, fine, you know, we were talking about our children, and she was very helpful and very nice. And since I haven't got a proper presentation, there's a picture of her, and he obviously he was the nicest possible man you could imagine. Very good photographer, very specialized in photographing artwork, and somehow the chemistry between the two of them didn't quite come off. So interesting again to know what exactly are their diary notes from photographers about working with her. Be interesting to cast the net a bit wider. There's also that whole situation of between what happens when a woman, sculptor in her case, gives instructions to a usually man photographer. How did that play out? I would also like to refer to that point of Brancusi, who was mentioned before. Hepworth is very often, or at least in the context of that 2015 exhibition at Tate, she is celebrated as someone who took control of her image and control of the images of her work. Is that so unusual generally? Is it just unusual because it was a woman working in two fields that were at the time dominated by men? Because Brancusi wouldn't let anyone else take photographs of his work. He did everything himself. So in that respect, Hepworth was actually not that extreme. Of course, we have still got also today, less so today, but there are people like Tony Craig who will be very controlling and very much aware of controlling their own image. You've got, for instance, I spent a morning there in his studio, took lots of pictures of him. He authorized just this one, which by eliminating all else, he forced that one image that showed him in a position in which he wanted to be seen. Which brings me to another question, which was also touched upon, there was a reference in a letter from her. Please destroy all the other images, Opera on the Rooftop, the ones she didn't like. Were they actually destroyed? And how many images that she did not authorize survived? Because personally, again, yes, I've been told I can only use this one picture of Tony Craig. I will definitely not delete all the others or destroy them. I would certainly hope that they end up in some archive, and I will just put restrictions on them and say they mustn't be used without the artist's consent or consent of his estate, whatever may be. I know from my own experience that there will be elements in those pictures which seem totally marginal now, but they might be important later on. I was photographing Anthony Gormley many years ago, 1994, and a tiny figure on the windowsill, which seemed interesting to me at the time. And I asked him about it, and he said, oh yeah, that's the next work. And then I carried on taking portraits of him. Turned out it was the Angel of the North. And if I had only taken pictures of him at the time when this major work was just in the process of being developed. So I reckon that pictures that Hepworth did not authorize, that show context, studio, that she may not have liked for whatever reason, they might yet be important. I would like to look at the relationship between sculpture and photography that has been touched on as well. Namely, David's remark was interesting about Brancusi's photographs being becoming very valuable as good photographs in their own right. Now, it struck me looking at Hepworth's photographs that they were utterly and entirely subordinate to her main chosen form of artistic expression, namely sculpture. And she strikes me very much as similar in that attitude to her contemporary painter, Ivan Hitchens, who again, in his field, drove just one line. He used photography as well. He had a Rolleiflex, he took lots of pictures. I can't see that Hepworth's pictures would stand as photographs in their own right, nor do I think she was personally perhaps interested in pursuing photography as such. It seems to me completely subordinate. And also interesting the way she took photographs of her work compared with what we have done, for instance, in the past few years for Art UK National Sculpture Documenting Project, which was very formal, very disciplined. No artist would perhaps tend to photograph their work in that way. One view front on, 90-degree left, 90-degree right, 45-degree left, 45-degree right, back of the sculpture, any details, signatures, foundry stamp or whatever. And then we were allowed one fun picture, which was one creative view of that work. So quite different to Hepworth's and presumably any other sculptor's approach to photographing their work. You could debate which is, they are both valuable in their own right, but from very different perspectives. I would also like to draw it's an impression which personally, which I've got no research evidence for that, but I assume that the next generation after Hepworth or Hitchens' contemporary used photography in a totally different way, in the sense that, for instance, Ivan Hitchens' son used photography as a medium totally in its own right, next to sculpture, next to painting, next to collage. And we see the same in other artists who are still alive and with us, Richard Wentworth, for instance, Andy Goldsworthy, you name it. Very nice Instagram account from Anne Christopher, RA sculptor. She uses photography quite independent from sculpture, which brings me to that shift in technical, well, in the way in which we use photography now, and to the third point, which I would be very much interested in. I am doing photography workshops once every year for the Royal Society of Sculptors for early career sculptors, and on the use of photography for documenting work and promoting their work. And the usual response, the first response is, it's going to take us yet more time. And it strikes me as interesting that time is becoming such an issue. It's in the sense that we seem to spend less time and more time on photography. I would like to know what percentage roughly of Hepworth's working time in the course of a year would she spend on photography in the widest sense, say, taking photographs, her own photographs, supervising photography, archiving photographs, selecting them. What percentage of her overall working time was devoted to that? And I would like to see it in today's context. Do we actually spend a lot more time on taking photographs because it's so much easier? And then we have a lot more pictures to archive and document. Or is there also a kind of blurring of boundaries going on, in that it is very hard to imagine that Hepworth would put hammer and chisel aside, so take up her camera, take a few quick pictures of what she has just done, and then carry on working, and then interrupt again and perhaps put a camera on a tripod, do a little video clip, put it quickly on social media and carry on working and so on. This blurring of boundaries between different media seems to have a strange effect, and perhaps it shifts our perception that we do spend more time on photography, and it's becoming an increasing burden and an obligation. But I would like to know, yes, which role that time element played, whether she even thought about it or whether she just got on with it because that's what everybody else did. So I think I'm not sure whether I have not worked this out in writing properly. So they are just responses to what strikes me as perhaps different or between her practice and what we see today. There are lots of other thoughts I had, but I am not too familiar with the exact, with very, very specific research that might have been done. I can only point out what I see as different to, or perhaps very much similar to sculptors' behavior and responses today. In summary, I would like to, personally, I would like to see or read more about the personal relationship she may have had with photographers. I would like to see photographers' records, if they exist, and which photographs might exist that she hasn't authorized or that haven't been published. I would like to know more about her approach to photography as a medium in its own right. And yes, this whole question of how much time was she prepared to put towards photography, and how does that play out in comparison to today's use of photography, which is much more blurred and mixed up with all sorts of other things we are doing, and with other art forms that all seem to blend into one another. That clear distinction that we had in Hepworth's time doesn't seem to exist anymore. Yes, okay, that's, I think, from my side.
Great, and that's